Hello and welcome to the Michael Mamas Show. I'm your host, Michael Mamas, coming to you from Mount Soma, home of the Sri Sameshwara Temple in the mountains of western North Carolina. Here today with Scott Davalos. Hey, Scotty.
Good morning.
And before we get into the main body of the podcast, there are just a few things that I'd like to just bring up real quick. First is, Scotty, you know about this Constitutional Convention Article 5, that thing that's going on?
No, I haven't got that one.
Yeah, this is pretty interesting. The founding fathers, what I guess they had this is my understanding, they had the realization that as time goes by, governments just have a natural tendency to become more and more centralized. The federal government kind of takes over. And so to safeguard against that, in Article 5 of the Constitution, there's this thing where they say if 2/3 of the states, which would be 34 states, if they vote to have a constitutional convention, they can do it. And then I guess the legislatures from each of the states, they get together and they can change the Constitution. But it takes 2/3 of the state to initiate that. But to change any one item in the Constitution requires not a 2/3 vote, but a 3/4 vote. So it takes a lot of it's got to be a significant percentage of the population to actually make that happen. But it's interesting that, a couple hundred years ago, the writers of the Constitution put that in there. Isn't that something, Scotty? It's like they knew that over time, the central government would get more and more powerful, and they wanted to keep a check on that.
Has anybody ever used it? Or?
No, excellent question. Never been used. But according to the people that are in favor of it, it was designed specifically for what's going on in our country today. So it's basically, are we into states' rights, or are we into the autocrats running everything? It's a delicate thing, but personally, I lean more in the direction of states' rights and even regional rights. I live in North Carolina. And I mean, Western North Carolina, I guess with the exception of Asheville, is, very different from Eastern North Carolina. Those are more big cities and more progressive. Western North Carolina tends to be a little more conservative, So certainly the states, like here's some of the things they were talking about changing. One is term limits. Right now, a guy can keep getting reelected, but even more than that, bureaucrats that aren't even elected, they're just hired, and we have bureaucrats in the State Department, in the Department of Defense, just permeating the whole federal government that are not elected officials, and they're there basically in perpetuity, and they get so entrenched in the bureaucracy of the whole thing. So we could limit those term limits. Also, education. It's in the Constitution that it's up to the states, education, but the federal government has taken that over, and I just think that's the kind of thing that's tough to delegate from Washington, D.C. and impose the kind of educational system they're going to have in Wyoming, for example. Things are just different. People are different. Demographics are different. And I just think the states would know better, which is the way that it was set up originally. Same with healthcare, balancing the budget. They could put an amendment in there that the budget has to remain balanced. Because right now, the bureaucrats, the thing has gotten so ridiculous, it's everybody going for that pork barrel, and fund their pet project, even if we have to borrow money to do it. because it gets them more votes because they're accommodating a certain small group, you know. Incidentally, the Constitutional Convention, the original meeting for it, if they vote in favor of it, and they're pretty close right now, they have 17 states, 4 more pretty much slam dunks. So, you know, another dozen states, 13 states, whatever, over and above that, and it could happen. But the first meeting would be in Washington, D.C., but they're saying that probably they'll take it out of Washington, D.C. Why? Because it's saturated with autocrats and lobbyists and things like that. And so they'll just get it out of Washington, D.C. and have it be something that's more representative of the states as opposed to representative of the central bureaucracy. So balancing the budget. Also, this thing about packing the courts. I mean, that would really be a can of worms, wouldn't it? Right now, there are 9 Supreme Court justices, but they want to do this thing where they can just add more. And so if can you imagine if the Supreme Court is too conservative, just throw in a handful of liberal Supreme Court justices, and then now you're controlling the judicial system. Of course, if you do that and then the conservatives take over, then they're going to throw in a bunch of conservative judges, and there's no end, you know. So they probably pass something to block that. Also, the whole thing about gun control. Gun control is a really interesting topic. Not all, but the vast majority of crimes that are committed with guns, the guns are not legally owned. There's a whole black market of guns out there, obviously. And so if you did outlaw guns or put more and more controls on guns, what happens is that you constrain the law-abiding citizens that are using their guns responsibly for home defense or whatever would be the ones that had their guns pooled. And so you're not really going after the guns you want to go after. And the whole thing about guns and the Second Amendment is really interesting anyway, because it's not about hunting. It's not even about home defense, really. The original idea is to have a militia so that if there was an attempt, and I know it sounds far-fetched in this country now, but is it really? If there was ever an attempt to overthrow the government or overthrow the country or really impose tyrannical limitations on the people could fight back. And I get that. I mean, even with me, it creates a real charge emotionally. But that was the original intent. And there are articles I've read by Eastern Europeans who have had guns. And back with the USSR and things like that, and the communists and all, they were saying that if it wasn't for the fact that the people had guns, the country would have gotten overtaken. And it was just the fact that the people were allowed to have guns that prevented a tyrannical overthrow. Now, I remember, I think I may have mentioned this in a podcast once or something, but I remember I said to somebody once, we were at Mount Soma, you know, and it was a nice day outside, and I pointed at Mount Soma Boulevard and I said, can you ever imagine the Chinese army marching down Mount Soma Boulevard? And they responded, no, I can't. And I said, exactly. And I said, and that's the problem. That's the problem. But in this day and age with nuclear warfare and stuff, there's an interesting comment that they said, what was that about the Russians? And the point is, in this day and age, they don't want to declare war and blow things up. They want to infiltrate. And, you know, they're saying that's what the Chinese have done with the educational institutions, the universities, the law schools, all like that. And
that brings up some. Did you hear the statistic that there's more engineers in China's being put out than the U.S. has engineers?
Well, it's interesting too, isn't it? Because even the whole woke thing now, I mean, engineering, that's obviously mathematically based, and math is now considered racist by CRT, and what's that going to do to the country, Anyway, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with this constitutional convention, this Article 5. Some people, on the other hand, are intimidated by it because if that happens, and then you get a majority to throw out the Second Amendment, they could do it. Take 3/4 vote, but they could do it. Anything could happen. The whole Constitution could get changed. But I think the general belief is that it would be a movement more in a conservative direction than a tyrannical, autocratic direction, Another thing I want to say, and this there's nobody out there, not a single person that's watching this podcast, not me, not you, Scotty, nobody. And there's no nation out there. There's no group of people out there that we can't see something that they did that wasn't ideal, And it seems like there's a tendency in the world right now to focus on the negative, even with the United States, the whole idea of patriotism is mocked. What is that? That's focusing on the good. That's focusing on the value, the laudable qualities of a nation. And obviously, boy, the United States has done some really crummy things through history. But if we focus on that, it goes back to what I talked about in the past, Dr. Shen, he was a Chinese doctor, world famous. And he used to say, I don't focus on disease, I focus on health. And we would do well to move more in that direction, just in general, not just with respect to nations, but with respect to individuals and how we get along with other people. And this whole idea, how did you put it, Scotty, when I mentioned this to you? Nobody is immune, I think you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, nobody is immune, Anybody they want to tear apart, anybody that anyone else wants to tear apart, they can find ammunition to do it, Now, and that brings us to this thing about Whoopi Goldberg, and she said that thing about, she said the Holocaust is not about race. She said it's about man's inhumanity to man. And of course, everything blew up. And obviously, she just would have been way better off not to even bring that up. It was all confusion. And she just didn't express herself well at all. And it's such a sensitive issue that it's better to just stay away from it, which she did not do. And she really got in some big trouble with it. But let's try to take a step back and give her a chance, because obviously she knows that it's about racism. That's obvious. And so what was she trying to say about this man's inhumanity to man? Well, we could say that what she was, and I think maybe what she was trying to get at, even though she wasn't really very clear, but just trying to understand her. Racism is one example of man's inhumanity to man. But even the Holocaust then can be thrown into that bigger generality of man's inhumanity to man, of which racism is one component. I think maybe that's what she was trying to say. I don't know. But the thing is, crucifying her, because here's the other thing. We all say stupid things. I have said stupid things, maybe even trying to talk about Whoopi was stupid of me, just because it's such a sensitive issue. People get so triggered so easily with it. But I think the point is to take a step back and try to understand, not overstand other people, and that'll kind of lead into what we're going to talk about here, but the main body of this podcast. The last thing, though, before we get into that, I wanted to talk about Russia and Ukraine. That's an interesting topic. And I haven't really heard anywhere in the news what I feel like is a thorough, if there is such a thing, coherent analysis of it. But things that I have heard is that in Kiev, which is pretty much right on the border. It's in Ukraine, but it used to be, I guess, that's where communism or Soviet Union, whatever, all that was founded there. But at any rate, um, the majority of the people there speak Russian, and there's two factions within the Ukraine. Some of the people would like Russia to come in and take over. Other people would not. Obviously, Germany is getting all of their oil and everything from Russia now, and they wouldn't want that to stop, and so that's why Germany, isn't real into, getting into conflict with Russia. They'd all freeze to death, Scotty, where Chernobyl, where the nuclear meltdown thing was?
Yeah.
That's in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't think we've really got to the bottom line of what the Ukrainians really want and what would be really better off for Ukraine. And also the implications. Let's say Russia did take over Ukraine. I haven't really heard any logical argument of how that would hurt Europe. I've heard arguments in both directions. Some say it doesn't matter. Others say, oh, it's terrible. Communist takeover, And then, of course, there's the argument about the sovereignty of nations and invading their borders. Well, that's largely rhetoric, isn't it? They didn't do anything about Tibet. Right now, the Chinese have, I don't know if you know this, but the Chinese have occupied parts of India with the military. I don't hear anybody complaining about that. The whole thing with Taiwan, they're wanting to take over Taiwan. I don't hear anybody. Right now, I do hear some people complaining about that, but nevertheless, that's, I think, a more likely threat. And even our own border, anyway, the bottom line there is I don't think anybody really knows, or if they do know, they're not saying, it's not in the news what's really going on there and what the implications are. I don't think so. Okay, well, anyway, probably everything I brought up kind of applies to the main body of the knowledge of this podcast. And the idea is that nothing needs to make sense. It's not about making sense. And I have to admit that I feel like a fool in a way, because how long has it been? How long have I been doing this, Scotty? 25 years or something in the form of the school and the temple, longer than that. What was it, 28 years or something? And really a big part of my passion was with respect to spirituality. It does make sense. There is a sense to it. And if we can just get to the logic and the sense of it, it deepens our understanding of it. It deepens our appreciation of it. It doesn't compromise it. But I realized that people are more emotionally based than logic. We have our feelings about our religion. We have our feelings not just about religion, but about Ukraine, about gun control, about you name any of these subjects. And there's an emotional undertone, an emotional basis to how a person feels about it. And as has been said, you can justify anything with the intellect, and they do. Based on how they feel, they create this intellectual justification. For example, with the border, I've heard people say, well, the southern border of the United States, that's just an arbitrary line in the sand. It's not real. So how can we protect the border? I mean, okay, I get it. There's a justification of the intellect there, but hello. My response to that is, well, your front door is an arbitrary line in the sand that got created and you put a door there. Does that mean anybody should be able to walk in whenever they feel like it? No. But that's just an example. But what we want to do is generalize this to the idea that making sense and having things be logical, which are two different things, which I'll get into in a minute, but it doesn't win arguments. In fact, if somebody has a feeling about something, an emotional feeling about something, be it the border or be it whatever, uh, and you do present a very logical, sensical argument, and it's so compelling that it's irrefutable, really. How does that emotionally based person tend to respond? And I include us all in there. I think we're all largely emotionally oriented. And how does an emotionally oriented person respond to that? They get angry. They've been pinned to the wall. And it's not how they feel. If their feelings are right or wrong, justifiable, not justifiable. And so it just initiates hysteria. It initiates anger. It initiates resentment. It initiates conflict. And then what do is they take this, some sort of, intellectual rationalization, justification, to argue back. And the whole thing is just a powder keg of nonsense. And so let's talk about sense, because it's got to make sense. But what is sense really? Sense, it's a very interesting word, because sense isn't just logic, it's also feeling. And what we're talking about there, logic and feeling, logic and emotion, what are we talking about? We're talking about the right and left sides of the brain. We're talking about the integration of awareness. Because without some sensing into what's natural, natural law, what's inherent in the nature of life, the nature of humanity, the whole idea of inalienable rights, that's where that comes from, really. So for things to make sense, there has to be an integration in the awareness. But that's not the tendency. The tendency is to be emotionally oriented, or you get these people that get so caught up into an intellectual justification that just seems so logical that they abandon the feeling. And again, anything I say, I could get me into trouble here. But for example, MIT, I understand there was a research program there, this was a long time ago, but they were going to grow sausage cancers because cancer grows really fast. They could make sausages out of it and feed the world. There's a logic there, but the feeling it just doesn't feel right, and there are a lot of things like that you can justify it logically, but it just doesn't feel right. So what we're talking about here isn't just pure feeling to base our lives upon, and it's also not just pure logic. It's an integration of the two. From there, that's where we tap into the depth of our inner wisdom, our soul, Mother Nature, that which is in harmony with nature, which is in harmony, that is to say, with natural law. You see, so this speaks, Scotty, doesn't it, to when you're trying to, let's say, reason with somebody. It makes a really sticky wicket, doesn't it? Because if you just give a completely logical argument, you end up pushing their buttons and alienating them. Oh, you're a silver-tongued devil, or maybe you are smarter than I am, but I know what I believe, kind of a thing. And so, how do you navigate those waters in a way where you can communicate, where you can commune, with other people in a manner that doesn't alienate us from our reason, doesn't alienate us from our inner deep feelings, but helps us to go deeper and find that truth. And that is a subtle art. That is not easy. That is not easy, especially if you get, well, just as one example, the field of religion, sticky wicket. You got to be really careful, otherwise you trigger people and they're off and running and it's over. So,
see,
yeah.
Seems like the issue seems like with that falls back on the person again and their inability to control their feelings getting hurt and being able to openly hear something. That goes for all of us. I mean, when somebody says, no, that's, you should be blah, 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 doing this, that, whatever. And then we don't have the ability of hearing them because we think we're smarter or whatever it is, or that hurts my feelings when somebody doesn't agree with me. It
Yeah.
it that mechanic just seems to get in the way
And
all.
then what happens oftentimes is they just go off on an intellectual tangent that has nothing to do with the original point. It's not what you were talking about. I remember that infamous lecture I gave in Asheville some years ago, Black Mountain actually, and I said, I talked about supply and demand, and it just people went nuts, and somebody in the back of the room yelled out, "I hate money," you know, and things like that. And the tangents that people went on had nothing to do with the fundamental point. You know, you're right, Scotty. I mean, it's just very difficult because what we live in, if we're really going to look at it from this perspective, we live in the meat grinder of public opinion. And the wave, the primary underlying basis of that wave of public opinion is largely emotionally based and not integrated with the logical side of the brain.
Well, is there anything you can talk about that we can, or is it just the way people are wired? Going back to that, because
That's a good question.
is it they just come out of the ground that way? What is it that we can do to kind of soften that grip or whatever they are, and that you know I stop that whatever is gonna like throw that pain thing that comes in when
Yeah.
when people are talking about a subject or whatever.
Well,
I don't know.
there are different ways to go about it for sure, and a lot of it's individual style. But one thing I think is once you've seen that you have triggered somebody, I think that's it. At least for the time being, you're done. And I'll say that to people oftentimes. If I see something like that going on, I'll say, okay, let's just wait. Let's give it a little while to come back into balance. You'll come back into balance. I'll come back into balance. And in a couple of days or whatever, we can talk. And it's amazing how often when you do that, a couple of days later, it's a non-issue. It got resolved within everybody's own being, and they kind of get where they were off, and it just becomes not worth it even to
But
stir all that up again.
but that's coming more from the giver, not the receiver. Now, from a receiver stand, us being receivers of this, whatever somebody's giving to us,
So
how do we?
when you mean receiver, you're the one that was triggered.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. There's
Okay.
two parts to it, right? There's the giver, the guy that's given the information, and the other one that's receiving it and then having a problem with it
Right. Right.
hurting their feelings, whatever. That from that receiver standpoint, what can we do from in that situation just to kind of
Well, I
okay,
think if we can do it is the thing. If we can do it, and if we can do it, then what we would do well to do is say, well, let's give this a little time and let's talk about it again in a couple of days. People tend not to do that. What people tend to do is make a judgment in the moment, and this is really interesting actually, even if the topic has fallen by the wayside and we can't even remember what the debate was about, we hold on to an image or resentment or an attitude towards that person that may really just very loosely, if at all, be related to the subject at hand. And so then the receiver, I think, is the one, and it's just a question of maturity, really. Uh, uh, because if we can't let it go, if we can't get past it, then we can't. But I think, and I'd like to really like to believe that even a subject like this, talking about this in this podcast, reflecting upon it on our own afterwards or whatever, can be constructive in moving us as individuals in a direction where we do handle things more responsibly.
but isn't it funny how it depends on that giver receiver model thing. If the guy that's or girl or whoever it is giving
Mm.
that information is somebody you respect and you know admire or whatever, hearing that is a whole different thing. You know what I mean? Versus there's something where then it's easy to receive at
I
that
think,
point.
yeah, that's true. but even if somebody you really respect can trigger you. And you know, Scotty, you've been into my classes, and a lot of what I do is try to push that envelope. You know, let's get into
Yeah.
this line between rational and irrational, and let's see if we can navigate those waters and work with it. And I think that can be
Yeah.
constructive. But oftentimes, what you find, and I've had this happen in my lectures. I give a lecture and I say something, and then afterwards I hear that somebody said, "Oh, well, he's," you know, and you hear it through the grapevine. "Oh, Michael said this," and I'm not buying it. Well, they don't bring it up. They don't discuss it. They just hold it, and then it becomes an anti-Michael thing, you know.
Right.
And when I've heard that in the past, that is not what I meant. That is not what I said. But it's too
Right.
late. It's
Right.
too late. You know, once that attitude towards an individual gets tainted, it's over. Now, there's another approach. Some people just don't get into debates. If somebody says something that is inappropriate,
Yeah.
they don't say, "Hey, wait a minute." They just, "Oh, okay," you know. And a lot of times, those people are considered very likable because they don't
Yeah.
get into it with anybody, but they're not standing up for anything really, other than, you know, smooth sailing and let's all just kumbaya, you know.
Right. It's
So
almost like there needs to be a formula that everybody
mm,
goes through. Okay.
it's a
First, I
good
have to check this.
it's a
Here's,
good ideal, but there is no formula.
I know.
Yeah,
It's just like,
and I think a large reason for that is it's so individual. We're all such
yeah.
individuals. So for each person, I think we do well to see if there's a way we can make it work,
Right.
you know, for ourselves based on who we are.
Yeah.
And I think for me, the main thing that I do in situations like that is just to try to get the person you're talking to say, well, let's take a step back. Let's give it a little time, give it a little space. Let's both think about it. And then we can, you know, talk about it after we're both back into balance.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's
and
almost like every individual would have to come up with their own formula of how
I
they
think that's right.
get past
How
that.
they would deal with it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, the number of times when that happens and people are just so, they can be passionate, they can be angry, they can be hysterical even. And if you give it a couple of days, it's a non-issue and they don't even care about it. They don't even want to talk about it anymore. It's over, you know? Well, I think this is good food for thought. I think we made the point. Also, making sense. I think if there's a bottom line here, sense, really making sense of something isn't just pure intellect and it's not just pure emotion. It's the integration of the two. And through that integration is how we go deeper into our own being. There's got to be that balance there. And that's called making sense. And that's what common sense is. And when common sense is developed to a really refined level, a really deep level, then it's called wisdom. Okay, I guess that's it for today, Scotty, unless there's anything more.
No, that's
Okay, all right. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll talk to you again next week.